Friedrich Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead is one of the most famous and most misunderstood statements in the history of philosophy. At its core, Nietzsche wasn't referring to the literal death of a divine being. He was describing the collapse of a world order, a profound shift in the way humanity understands itself and its place in the universe. The very idea of God as a central figure who defined morality, meaning, and purpose had ceased to hold sway over Western thought, and with that loss, an existential crisis was set in motion. The phrase God is dead comes from Nietzsche's work The Gay Science, written in the late 19th century, during a time when the traditional systems of belief were beginning to crumble under the weight of scientific progress, political revolutions, and the rise of secular ideologies. For centuries, the Christian narrative had given humanity a moral compass. The idea of a higher being, an omniscient God, had shaped Western civilization's understanding of good and evil, of right and wrong, of meaning and purpose. People knew their place in the grand cosmic order. They were created in the image of God, and their lives were meant to follow the divine will. But then came modernity, and with it, the erosion of that foundational worldview. The Enlightenment, with its focus on reason and empirical evidence, undermined the theological explanations that had governed human understanding. Science, which offered more concrete answers about the world than religious dogma ever could, slowly dislodged God from his central position in the intellectual and cultural life of Europe. People began to question the certainty of religious truths, especially as they were confronted with the realities of a rapidly changing world industrialization, new philosophies, and the discoveries of figures like Darwin, who shook the very foundations of belief in a divine creator. Nietzsche recognized that this shift was inevitable. For him, it wasn't a question of whether or not people would stop believing in God. It was a matter of when. The death of God was, in some ways, the natural consequence of humanity's intellectual development. But Nietzsche also understood the deep, unsettling consequences of this death. Without a higher power to guide them, humans would be forced to face the terrifying reality of living in a universe devoid of intrinsic meaning. The collapse of religious belief wasn't just a theological issue, it was a philosophical and existential one. If the divine no longer provided the framework for meaning, then what was left? What could replace it? This void, Nietzsche argued, would lead many to despair, to nihilism, the belief that life has no inherent purpose. And in the face of this nihilism, some would turn to false solutions, clinging to ideologies, power structures, or consumerist distractions in a desperate attempt to fill the emptiness. But Nietzsche was not one to wallow in despair. In fact, his entire philosophy was a response to this crisis. If God was dead, then it was up to humans to redefine their lives, to create their own meaning in the absence of divine or preordained purpose. This is where his concept of the Übermensch, or Superman, comes in. The Übermensch is an individual who, rather than succumbing to the nihilism of the post-God world, takes full responsibility for their life and values. They rise above the herd mentality, the moral constraints imposed by society and religion, and create their own path, their own set of values. The Übermensch is not a figure of arrogance or power in the traditional sense. Rather, they are someone who has transcended conventional thinking, someone who embraces the freedom that comes with the death of God. They recognize that with the collapse of divine authority, they are free to shape their own existence. It's a terrifying freedom, yes, but also an empowering one. The death of God, Nietzsche argues, opens the door for the creation of a new kind of human, one who no longer looks outside for answers, but finds them within. This moment in history, the death of God, forces us to ask deep, difficult questions about the meaning of life, the nature of morality, and the future of humanity. With the divine no longer standing as an external source of truth, humans are left to their own devices. And it's this freedom that is both exhilarating and terrifying. What do we do when the traditional answers to life's most pressing questions no longer suffice? How do we navigate a world without a preordained meaning? Nietzsche's answer was radical. We must take up the mantle of responsibility for our own lives and create meaning in a world that offers none. In the grand scheme of history, Nietzsche's proclamation may seem like a small moment, a single phrase, a footnote in the broader narrative of intellectual history, but its implications are far-reaching. For Nietzsche, the death of God was not a catastrophe to mourn, but a revolutionary moment, an opportunity for humanity to evolve, to become something greater than it had ever been before. But this evolution wouldn't be easy. It would require each of us to confront our own beliefs, our own values, and to ask whether we are truly living in accordance with our deepest truths. For Nietzsche, the death of God was a challenge to humanity, a challenge to break free from the chains of traditional morality and to embrace a new kind of freedom, one that could only come through radical self-determination. It's a message that resonates deeply in today's world, as modern society becomes increasingly secular, as more people question the traditional structures of power and belief. Nietzsche's warning and his call to arms become more urgent. The death of God is not merely a theological event, but a psychological and cultural shift that demands our attention. It calls us to grapple with the meaning of our existence, to take responsibility for our own lives, and to create a world in which we are no longer slaves to the past, but architects of our future. In the end, Nietzsche's declaration is not one of despair, but of liberation. The death of God, while unsettling, opens the door to new possibilities. The question is, what will we do with this newfound freedom? When the divine order is removed, the consequences are far-reaching, not just in terms of culture or society, but in the very core of our psychological being. For centuries, humans lived with a sense of assurance. There was a higher meaning to life, a divine purpose woven into the fabric of existence. The divine provided a roadmap, a structure through which we could navigate the complexities of life, providing answers to questions about morality, suffering, and our ultimate purpose. But what happens when that structure is dismantled? What happens when we are left without the comforting belief that there is a higher power guiding us through life? The death of God, as Nietzsche proclaimed, creates a profound psychological void. People are suddenly forced to confront the staggering weight of their own existence. In a world without inherent meaning, why am I here? What is the point of my life? These questions, which were once answered by religious or metaphysical systems, now hang in the air, unanswered. The psychological toll of this uncertainty is immense. It leaves many feeling unmoored, lost in an ocean of possibilities, but without a compass to guide them. This existential vacuum is the breeding ground for nihilism, the belief that life is inherently meaningless, without a higher purpose or a moral framework handed down from a divine source. Everything begins to feel arbitrary. Morality becomes subjective, truth becomes relative, and the structure that once provided a sense of order now seems like a mere illusion. As Nietzsche predicted, many people will fall into despair. Without a transcendent force giving their lives meaning, they might begin to see existence as a senseless struggle, a random series of events that have no greater significance. Jean-Paul Sartre, a French existentialist philosopher, explored the psychological fallout of this void in his works. According to Sartre, when God is no longer present, human beings are condemned to freedom. But this freedom is not a gift, it's a burden. Without a divine order to guide us, we are entirely responsible for creating our own meaning in life. This is both empowering and terrifying. Sartre's famous assertion that existence precedes essence means that we are not born with an inherent purpose. Instead, we must define our own. This places an immense responsibility on the individual, but also exposes them to the anxiety of having to make choices without any ultimate guidelines. The absence of God, then, is not just a theological issue but a psychological crisis, a confrontation with the ultimate freedom and the existential anxiety that comes with it. The psychological fallout of a world without God manifests in various ways, one of which is an increase in existential despair. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, offered a profound insight into how humans respond to the loss of meaning. In his book Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl's experiences in the concentration camps led him to the realization that even in the most horrific conditions, human beings can find meaning in their suffering. Frankl's approach, known as logotherapy, is based on the idea that life's meaning can be found through personal responsibility, even in the face of immense suffering. However, Frankl also recognized the darker side of the human condition in a world without inherent meaning. For many, the absence of a guiding purpose leads to despair. This despair, when left unchecked, can spiral into nihilism. As individuals wrestle with the futility of existence, the result is often a profound sense of emptiness and depression, a state in which the individual struggles to find any reason to continue. The psychological breakdown caused by this existential crisis is not limited to a few individuals, but can spread through entire societies as they grapple with the lack of a shared, unifying meaning. The tension between despair and hope in this new world is not just philosophical, it plays out in everyday lives. In a world devoid of traditional meaning, people often seek substitutes to fill the void. One such substitute is consumerism. In the absence of a transcendent purpose, the acquisition of material goods becomes a way of constructing meaning, if only temporarily. The desire for possessions, status, and wealth fills the emptiness left by the death of God, offering a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but ultimately leaving the person feeling as hollow as before. This quest for external validation is emblematic of the way modern society has tried to cope with the existential crisis. Created by the loss of traditional beliefs, addiction, too, becomes a powerful way to escape from this deep-seated anxiety. Whether it's drugs, alcohol, or even technology, the addiction to short-term pleasure or distraction serves as a means of avoiding the harsh reality of living without meaning. In this sense, addiction is not merely about the substance or the behavior, it is about the escape from existential dread. The addict is seeking relief from the unanswerable questions that plague the mind in a world without a higher purpose. The overwhelming sense of despair, the crushing weight of freedom, and the anxiety of uncertainty all drive individuals toward these temporary forms of relief. But Nietzsche didn't see these psychological consequences as inevitable. In fact, he argued that they could be overcome. His concept of the Übermensch, the Overman or Superman, represents a person who embraces the chaos and uncertainty of a world without God. Rather than succumbing to nihilism, the Übermensch creates their own meaning, their own values, and their own purpose. It is a difficult, painful process, but it is ultimately liberating. The existential crisis, in Nietzsche's view, is not something to be avoided or feared, but something to be transcended. In this way, the death of God can be a catalyst for human growth, a challenge to rise above the despair and create a life that is meaningful on our own terms. For many, however, this path is not easy. The struggle to find meaning in a world that offers none is a deeply personal one, and the psychological consequences of living without God are profound. But it is also an opportunity for reinvention. The loss of divine order may feel like a void, but it can also be the blank canvas on which we can write our own stories, build our own purpose, and become the architects of our own destinies. The collapse of the religious and metaphysical order in the modern era was not simply a philosophical shift, but a seismic transformation that reverberated throughout Western society. As traditional religious beliefs eroded, they left behind a void, one that was not only existential but societal. The centuries-long reign of Christianity as the foundation of moral, cultural, and political life began to crumble in the 19th and 20th centuries, giving rise to modernism and secularism. These ideologies, built on the pillars of reason, science, and humanism, marked a dramatic departure from the traditions that had governed Western civilization for millennia. The Industrial Revolution was one of the primary forces driving this transformation. The rapid advancements in technology, the rise of mass production, and the birth of a capitalist economy reshaped not only how people worked, but also how they understood themselves and their place in the world. No longer was human life structured around religious observance and traditional roles within a community. Instead, individuals were now part of an increasingly fragmented society, defined by their economic roles, their relationship to technology, and their pursuit of material progress. At the heart of this transformation was a profound shift from faith to reason, from belief in the supernatural to a reliance on science. The Enlightenment had already laid the groundwork for this change, with thinkers like Immanuel Kant and René Descartes championing the power of human reason over religious dogma. By the time the 19th century rolled around, the industrialized world had fully embraced the notion that human progress could be measured in scientific terms, and that knowledge itself could be amassed through empirical observation and experimentation. The power of reason, once confined to intellectual circles, now permeated every aspect of life, promising a future free from the uncertainties and superstitions of the past. Yet, as Nietzsche warned, this triumph of secularism and reason came with a profound cost. The collapse of the religious and metaphysical order meant that the moral and ethical frameworks that had previously bound society together also began to disintegrate. Traditional sources of authority, such as the church and religious texts, were now questioned, and in many cases discarded. What had once been understood as absolute truths, the divine order, the moral law, were now viewed as human inventions, relics of a bygone era. With these structures gone, society was left to grapple with a question that had no easy answer. If there is no God, who decides what is right or wrong? The result was a breakdown in social cohesion. No longer did people share the same metaphysical beliefs about the world, the afterlife, or the purpose of existence. In place of these common narratives, new ideologies emerged, some political, some philosophical, that sought to fill the void left by religion. The rise of secular humanism promised a moral framework based on human reason and empathy rather than divine command, while political movements such as socialism, communism, and nationalism offered alternative visions of the good life and a just society. But these new ideologies, for all their intellectual sophistication, were often unable to provide the same deep sense of shared meaning that religion once had. And in many cases, these ideologies became as rigid and dogmatic as the belief systems they replaced. The disintegration of traditional beliefs had profound consequences on the political stage as well. The 19th and 20th centuries were marked by violent revolutions and wars, most notably the two world wars that were in part fueled by the ideological clashes that arose in the wake of secularism's rise. The intellectual battles between capitalism, communism, fascism, and other ideologies were not just political struggles. They were existential ones, with each system promising to fill the moral and metaphysical void left by the death of God. Nietzsche himself was acutely aware of the dangers inherent in this period of ideological conflict. He warned that the erosion of religious belief and the loss of a shared moral foundation could lead to a world of competing ideologies, each claiming the truth and trying to impose it on others. This struggle for meaning, he argued, could lead to chaos, oppression, and violence. The 20th century's wars and revolutions, as destructive as they were, could be seen as tragic manifestations of this search for meaning and power in a world that had lost its connection to the divine. In the aftermath of these wars, modernism continued to evolve, giving rise to new forms of art, literature, and philosophy. Writers like Franz Kafka and T.S. Eliot, artists like Pablo Picasso, and philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre explored the disillusionment and alienation that accompanied the loss of traditional beliefs. Modernism, in its various forms, was an attempt to understand and express the human experience in a world no longer shaped by religious or metaphysical certainty. But while modernism sought to address the chaos of a world without God, it often did so by embracing the fragmentation and uncertainty that had come to define the age. Despite these challenges, the rise of modernism and secularism represented a profound shift in human consciousness. It marked a break from the past, an attempt to create meaning and order in a world that had lost the divine certainties that had once provided it. Nietzsche's warning was clear: the rise of secularism and the rejection of tradition might be liberating, but it also brought with it a sense of profound disorientation. In rejecting the old world of divine authority, humanity found itself standing at the precipice, gazing into the abyss of meaninglessness. The search for new sources of meaning, whether through political ideologies, scientific progress, or humanist ideals, became the defining challenge of modern life. But as Nietzsche understood, the search for meaning in a secular world is not without peril, and without a new moral framework to replace the old, humanity risks falling into despair, violence, and nihilism. The modern era, then, is marked by an ongoing struggle between freedom and despair, between the search for meaning and the haunting awareness of its absence. The death of God may have opened up new possibilities, but it also left humanity to confront its own mortality and meaninglessness in this brave new world. The task is not just to create new ideologies or replace old ones, but to find ways to live authentically in a world where the divine no longer provides the answers. In the shadow of God's death, humanity did not stand still. It moved restlessly, feverishly toward something else. What filled the vacuum left by the divine was not a new spiritual awakening or a rebirth of meaning, but a kind of quiet surrender to comfort, distraction, and consumption. Nietzsche foresaw this. He warned not just of nihilism, but of what would follow in its wake: the last man, a creature of contentment and safety, a being stripped of ambition, depth, and desire for anything transcendent, a soul asleep in the bright lights of progress. In today's world, the last man thrives. Technology, capitalism, and the promise of perpetual progress have become the new gods of the modern age. They offer convenience, pleasure, and the illusion of control, but they also ask for something in return: your attention, your time, and ultimately, your soul. In an era where everything is optimized for efficiency and gratification, the ancient questions "Who am I? Why am I here? What is worth suffering for?" are drowned out by the hum of machines, the ping of notifications, and the relentless pursuit of more. This is not merely a cultural shift, it's an existential crisis. The promise of technology was liberation. It would free us from toil, disease, isolation. It would connect us, educate us, empower us, and to some degree, it has. But in the same breath, it has also disoriented us. It has severed us from nature, from one another, and from ourselves. In the name of connection, we have grown lonely. In the name of progress, we have lost direction. We scroll endlessly, binge thoughtlessly, and shop compulsively, not out of need, but to fill a hole that material goods can never satisfy. Consumerism, in this context, is not just an economic system, it is a philosophy of life. It tells us that our worth is measured by what we own, how we look, and how we are perceived. Success is no longer internal fulfillment or a network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. When the great metaphysical pillars of existence collapse, the void they leave behind is rarely left empty for long. In a world where God is dead, the vacuum of meaning becomes a battleground, a contested space where new gods, new idols, and new masters arise. Nietzsche, ever the prophet of uncomfortable truths, foresaw that in the absence of an overarching moral and spiritual authority, power itself would become the new object of worship. Those who could shape narratives, command belief, and dictate reality would rule over the disoriented masses. Today, we live in that world. The 20th and 21st centuries have not been devoid of belief. They have simply transferred their allegiance. Instead of looking upward to the heavens, people now look outward to governments, corporations, media empires, and digital platforms. These institutions understand a profound and unsettling truth: that in a society stripped of shared meaning, the masses are highly malleable. Without a unifying metaphysical anchor, reality itself becomes a commodity to be manufactured, sold, and weaponized. Propaganda is no longer the crude posters and radio broadcasts of old. It is the seamless integration of ideology into entertainment, advertising, and news cycles. It is the shaping of public opinion through the carefully curated images of social media, the invisible algorithms that feed you what you want to hear, reinforcing your biases until you mistake them for objective truth. In this landscape, truth itself is fragmented, relativized, and ultimately rendered irrelevant. What matters is not what is true, but what is believed. Control perception, and you control reality. Nietzsche warned of this in his critique of master-slave morality. Those who wield power, be it political, economic, or cultural, have always understood that moral systems can be constructed as tools of control. By defining what is good and evil, right and wrong, sacred and profane, the powerful can manipulate the very conscience of the people. And when the old religious and moral codes fall away, the opportunity for constructing new systems of control becomes even greater, because the population hungry for certainty in an uncertain world is desperate to believe in something, anything. In modern society, we witness this manipulation in countless forms. Political leaders craft grand narratives of fear and salvation, framing themselves as the only bulwark against chaos. Corporations build brands that promise meaning and identity, selling not just products but lifestyles, dreams, and belonging. Tech giants, through surveillance capitalism, harvest our deepest desires, fears, and habits, not to liberate us, but to sell us back to ourselves in ever more addictive and profitable ways. Every click, every search, every moment of digital attention becomes another data point, another brick in the invisible prison we ourselves help build. Contemporary conspiracy theories often emerge from a dim awareness of this manipulation, but they too can be co-opted and weaponized. Where once conspiracies were the domain of critical skeptics challenging unjust power, today they are just as often traps, narratives spun to divide, distract, and destabilize. In a world without clear moral and epistemological anchors, the question is no longer is it true, but whose truth is it? In this battlefield of realities, paranoia becomes a default state, and cynicism a survival mechanism. The rise of conspiracy culture is, in some sense, a symptom of a deeper existential crisis. People instinctively feel that something is wrong, that unseen forces are shaping their lives, but in the absence of coherent metaphysical narratives, they often grasp at shadows. They sense manipulation, but cannot name the manipulators. And so, in the chaos, power operates more freely than ever, because while the masses argue about the puppet masters remain unseen. Nietzsche's insights into the will to power are chillingly relevant here. In the post-God world, power does not simply manifest through brute force, but through the subtle shaping of desires, beliefs, and identities. Those who can master the art of narrative manipulation become the new priests and kings of a secular age. They do not need to impose order by violence, they impose it by manufacturing consensus. Corporate monopolies exert more influence over daily life than most nation-states. Surveillance capitalism predicts and influences human behavior on a scale never before imagined. Political propaganda, refined by decades of psychological research, molds public sentiment with chilling precision. And all the while, the masses, craving meaning but fearful of freedom, cling to the easy narratives offered to them, even when those narratives diminish them. Nietzsche's warning is not merely that humanity would lose its belief in God, but that it would replace God with lesser idols, money, status, security, ideology, each demanding its own form of devotion, each exerting its own form of control. In the end, the manipulation of the masses is not just a political problem, but a metaphysical one. It stems from the deep human need for meaning in a world that no longer provides it naturally. When that need is exploited rather than honored, when it is manipulated rather than nurtured, society falls not only into oppression, but into spiritual decay. The question that remains is a difficult one. In a world of manufactured realities and invisible masters, how does one reclaim authenticity? How does one live freely in an age that profits from your illusions? Nietzsche's answer is not comforting, but it is clear. You must create your own meaning. You must, against all odds, will yourself into freedom. It is a dangerous, lonely task, but it is the only alternative to being ruled by those who understand better than you how easily a lost soul can be led. When Nietzsche declared that God is dead, he wasn't celebrating. It was a lament, a warning, and a call to arms all at once. It was the diagnosis of a profound existential wound, and also a challenge. Now that the divine scaffolding of the universe had collapsed, what would we do with our freedom? Would we sink into nihilism, unestheticized by comfort and distraction? Or would we rise to the occasion, daring to forge meaning where none is given? In the ruins of inherited truth, Nietzsche offered a vision, not a return to the old, but an ascent to something higher. He called it the Übermensch, the Overman, a being who creates his own values in the absence of divine command. The Übermensch is not a tyrant or a brute. He is not motivated by dominance or ego. He is someone who has stared into the abyss, felt the vertigo of meaninglessness, and emerged stronger. He is the one who says yes to life not just when it's beautiful, but also when it's painful, uncertain, and absurd. The journey to becoming the Übermensch begins not in triumph, but in confrontation with one's own despair, fear, and limitations. Nietzsche spoke of self-overcoming, the act of turning one's suffering, flaws, and struggles into the very fuel for transformation. In a post-God world, the heroic act is no longer obedience, but creation. It is no longer about submitting to an external authority, but about becoming the author of your own destiny. This is not a solitary struggle of the elite few. It is a universal challenge. Every person who chooses to live authentically, to think deeply, act deliberately, and love courageously is engaging in this existential creation. And though the weight of freedom is immense, so too is its potential. One path toward meaning lies in responsibility, not the kind forced upon us by systems or traditions, but the radical kind we take on willingly. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, wrote that meaning is not something to be discovered like buried treasure. It is something we assign through our choices and commitments, even in the most horrific conditions imaginable. Frankl found that those who survived with dignity were the ones who believed their suffering had a purpose, who transformed pain into testimony, tragedy into resistance. Another path is through creative expression. When traditional meaning structures collapse, art becomes more than decoration, it becomes salvation. In creating music, painting, literature, philosophy, or even movements for justice, we affirm our existence. We say, I was here, I felt this, I believe this mattered. Artists like Dostoevsky, Kafka, and Camus wrestled with the weight of godlessness and used that tension as raw material. They did not shy away from despair, they mined it for gold. Similarly, activists and thinkers who challenge power structures do so not merely out of political frustration, but because they see a deeper truth, that in shaping the world, they are shaping themselves. In defying systems of control, they are asserting their own capacity for moral judgment. It is no accident that Nietzsche's work has inspired both rebels and reformers, because to live in a post-God world is to recognize that if there is no external judge, we must become the judges of ourselves. And yet, this creation of meaning is not about isolation or solipsism. It does not mean ignoring others or pretending that everything is subjective. It means engaging with the world and other people as co-creators, not as enemies or puppets. It means recognizing the sacredness of life, not because it was divinely granted, but because we choose to treat it as sacred. It means forging bonds not out of shared doctrine, but out of mutual recognition. This is the quiet revolution of post-God meaning. It is no longer about being given purpose, but about giving purpose. It is about choosing love over cynicism, beauty over apathy, responsibility over blame. In a universe that offers no final answers, each moment becomes more precious, not less. Each choice becomes a creative act, a brushstroke on the vast and uncertain canvas of existence. This is not easy. It never was meant to be. Nietzsche himself admitted that most people would not become Übermensch, and that many would prefer the comfort of ready-made beliefs and borrowed identities. But he also believed that even the attempt to live authentically was worthwhile. Even the striving toward meaning was, in itself, meaningful. In the end, Nietzsche's message is not one of despair, but of awakening. The death of God is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where humanity, freed from the chains of imposed morality, can choose to live deliberately, to suffer nobly, to love fiercely, and to create joyously. So, what do we do now? We begin, not with certainty, but with courage, not with doctrine, but with decision. We become the authors of our own morality, the architects of our own reality. We choose to live, not because life comes with meaning, but because we can give it meaning. And in that act, in that rebellion against the void, we become more than what we were told we could be. We become human in the fullest sense. When Nietzsche declared that God is dead, he was not offering a simple conclusion. He was opening a door that leads into an abyss, yes, but also to a horizon unbound by old limitations. The void that so many fear is not a grave, but a birth. It is the place where old certainties crumble, and in their ashes, the possibility of something new, something truly our own, rises. To embrace the void is to recognize that nothing is promised. No meaning is given from on high. No blueprint waits for us in the stars. And yet, precisely because of this, everything is possible. In the absence of external dictates, we are not condemned, but liberated, freed from the tyranny of inherited answers. We are summoned to ask our own questions, to forge our own paths. This is not the easy path. It demands courage. It demands a willingness to confront the chaos without flinching, to bear the weight of existence without the crutch of illusion. It demands that we stand alone, at least for a time, and find within ourselves the strength to say yes to life, not because life is easy or fair or certain, but because it is ours. Every doubt you have wrestled with, every dark night you have endured, every moment of disillusionment you have survived, these are not signs of failure. They are signs that you are alive in the most profound sense. They are invitations to rise, to create, to become. In the end, Nietzsche's message is not that life is meaningless, but that it is unassigned, and therefore infinitely full of potential. The void is not an end, it is a beginning. You are the meaning maker now, and in that sacred responsibility, in that terrifying freedom, lies the greatest hope humanity has ever known.